When you analyze the history of humanity, it does not matter what era we are talking about – ancient, medieval, contemporary, or modern. But also when we observe behavior in Eastern or Western societies. Women have always been and are considered less than men. But there was no worse time against women, especially black women, when we talk about the slave system imposed by European nations during the colonization process of the fertile lands of the New World, now known as America. As a way of exploiting the territories under the domination of the colonial empires, slavery was born out of the need to look for cheap labor to work the land. Reasons why millions of black slaves were brought from Africa on the slave ships used to transport slaves, in which enslaved black men, women, and children was the most valuable merchandise. Black African slaves, who were seen as commodities according to the transatlantic slave market, by slave traders in the British colonies in America. Do not have the slightest doubt that the black slaves were only seen by the slave owners as merchandise, a working tool that was bought and sold, not as human beings, just like them. There was a great difference between male and female slaves. The black slave women, apart from using their bodies to work hard in the field and in servitude, also had to satisfy the sexual needs of some slave owners, but also used their womb to give birth to more slaves, which, contrary to what one thinks, women have a higher commercial value than men. If enslaved black men had a difficult life, you cannot imagine the life of an enslaved black woman on large plantations, where their bodies were used as a farm that produced slaves. Slaves who never got to know their parents, because they were sold as commodities to other agricultural plantations, especially when we talk about the slave states in the southern part of the United States. The reproductive life cycle of enslaved women largely consisted of rape by slave owners and other slaves, forced pregnancy, childbirth on a slave farm, and with little or no recovery, many of them within 6 to 12 weeks could be pregnant again, which was a cycle of pregnancy that never ended for many black women during the slave system, where there was a huge need for slave workers. The slavery of black women was worse than that of black men, because these women had to bear children and deal with sexual abuse in addition to doing the work assigned to them, work that is often similar in type and quantity to that of male slaves. When it was profitable to exploit women as if they were men in the workforce, slave owners viewed slave women as genderless when assigning work tasks. But they could also be exploited in ways doing tasks only for women, such as giving birth and raising children. But they were also considered subordinate to men in housework and work in the fields. The white slave women realized that the white patriarch had the power to force them to mate with whomever he chose, reproduce, or suffer the consequences, limit the time they spent with their children, and even sell them and their children. From the beginning of adolescence, females were subject to their master's desire that they reproduce, because increasing the number of slaves meant profit for the owner. Intervention in the procreation process, either by subtle or forceful means, because the black woman's womb was seen as a farm for children. Make no mistake about it, childbirth began at an early age, when girls showed the first signs her body was physically developed as women, or were old enough to work in the fields and to give birth to children, who would be born as slaves. Children who were born, not as the property of the mother, but as the property of the slave owners, who often saw this child as a commodity, which increased the wealth of the slave owner. When you analyze this type of narrative, there is no doubt in your mind that this was a sad reality of exploitation of the reproductive apparatus of enslaved women. Something that you must understand is that the accumulation of wealth, in which the ideas of primitive capitalism, was always behind slavery in all the European colonies. And let's not talk about the 13 British colonies where the slave was a work tool. When a baby was born, the slave owner could start earning interest on the baby, which had a cash value on the slave market at birth. Do not have the slightest doubt. Violence, sales, purchases, rents, and the separation of slave children from their mothers were the harsh reality of enslaved women, especially in those cities that were part of the main posts where black slaves arrived. As was the case of Port of Charleston, was the largest slave port in the United States, and most enslaved Africans passed through the city. 12 million Africans were brought to America between the 16th and 19th century. It is estimated that 500,000 were sent to what is now known as the United States. About 645,000 slaves were brought to the 13 British colonies in the Northeast region via the transatlantic slave trade, equivalent to 5% of the slaves brought from Africa to the Americas, mostly to southern plantations. In the 1680s and in 1710, the African population in Virginia had increased to 23,100, 42% of the total. Maryland had 8,000 Africans, 14.5% of the total. In 1641, Massachusetts became the first colony to authorize slavery through enacted law. In the northern states, enslaved black men were used as farm laborers in farming communities in parts of upstate New York and Long Island, Connecticut, and New Jersey, but also used to work as domestic servants, laborers, and artisans, the largest number being in the cities, where many men worked on the docks and in shipping. Enslaved blacks in the South worked primarily on farms and plantations that grew indigo, rice, and tobacco and cotton. Plantation owners used enslaved workers to grow staple crops. Slaves also worked in the craft trades on the large plantations and in many port cities of the South. In 1720, about 65% of the population of South Carolina were slaves. To get an idea of the enormous importance of the exploitation of the body of black women had for the British slave system, which were used as part of the slave farms in the American territories. From 1770 to 1860, the rate of natural growth of slaves in the British colonies in America was much greater than the population growth of any nation in Europe and was almost twice as fast as the rate of population growth in England. In the territories in the South, developed an agricultural economy dependent on staple crops, which this agricultural plantations quickly acquired a significantly larger number of enslaved people, as their staple crops were labor-intensive. The business of creating slaves using the wombs of black women was so good for slave owners that some of the British colonies tried to abolish the international slave trade, fearing that the importation of new Africans could be detrimental to their business. Virginia bills to this effect were vetoed by the British Privy Council. Rhode Island banned the importation of enslaved people in 1774. All colonies except Georgia had banned or limited the African slave trade by 1786. Georgia did it in 1798. In many of these states, the sale of slaves on the street also began to be prohibited, as was the case in the port city of Charleston, South Carolina. For many slave plantations, it was much cheaper to buy locally produced slaves at lower prices than to buy slaves in international markets in the face of anti-slavery movements in many parts of the world. And if you add to that local slaves spoke the language, they had less chance of escaping or having any kind of contagious disease. But you also knew the history of that slave. Something that we must understand. The business of keeping slaves was so lucrative that it was not only the plantations that owned slaves, there were also slave traders that benefited from this business. Many of the slave owners lived in the city, not necessarily in the big house of the plantations. Enslaved African American blacks performed a variety of jobs, from manual labor to housework to skilled trades. Slaves were also often traded or rented to other owners or chiefs in the area they needed for several days of slave work. If an enslaved person worked for someone else, the slave owner was the one who would receive payment for the work. Some revisionists of American history consider that black women were essentially legally raped, given the character of property assigned by the slave states, where slaves had no rights. Others considered that it was an industry supported by the rape and exploitation of the body of black women. We could assert that enslaved women had no right to their bodies, no right to their children, no right to refuse reproduction, to which they were subjected by black slave owners and sellers. When you live in a society in which slaves were seen as a commodity, there was also the idea that there were no slave boys or girls, but there were also no black children, since they were only seen as the younger versions of enslaved bodies. As merchandise, they could be sold, beaten, raped, killed, and discarded. And let's not talk if some of them become a burden for the slave owner due to medical problems. The painful story of rape of black women, auction and abuse of slaves in British colonies can never be told in its entirety. and more so in a society controlled by whites who do not like this negative narrative that tarnishes the image of their European ancestors.